me, I'm Lynn. I'm the Spiritual Program Coordinator at Jamyang Leeds, and I'm very happy to welcome back with us today Khen Rinpoche Geshe Jamphel, the Abbot of Nalanda Monastery. We were enjoying his teachings on Atisha's Lamp on the Path back at the end of last year in 2020, and we're very grateful he can be with us again now to continue. Last year we had an introduction to the text and then covered verses 1 to 4, so we'll be continuing from verse 5 today. And if anybody here missed the teachings last year, they were recorded, so if you look on Jamyang Leeds YouTube channel, you can catch up. I'd also just like to welcome Venerable Irene, also from Nalanda. Welcome, Venerable Irene. And in case anybody is wondering, last year we had Venerable Tachin acting as our interpreter, our translator, and he's actually on retreat at the moment. So we welcome Yulika, who is joining us from Vienna, am I right, since it's Vienna, to be our translator for tonight and for the next few classes.
Yeah, almost right. I am normally based in Vienna, at present in the Black Forest in southern Germany.
Thank you. That sounds lovely. Right. So we'll start with some brief prayers. I will just share my screen, and after that, I shall be handing over to Geshe Jamphel.
Hello. It's okay now.
Thangbo Mönlam Geri Duara.
Yeah.
Sorry. My apologies, my screen doesn't want to share.
26 number.
Modi this lega chema son logle seguido. Logle.
Let me just try this and see if I can make this work. It's here. Can you see that now? Is that working? Thank you, Kerry. Right.
Yes.
So we will do the refuge and bodhicitta prayer 3 times as usual. So I take refuge until I am enlightened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my merits of listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha to benefit transmigratory beings. I take refuge until I am enlightened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my merits of listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha to benefit all transmigratory beings. I take refuge until I am enlightened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my merits of listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha to benefit all transmigratory beings. Thank you. And now I shall hand over to Geshe Jamphel. Welcome.
Okay, thank you. Julia Rason?
Rason. Riritachi.
26 Tina Daya, Pejade.
Kansula?
You should tell you the one under the
Really?
Oh, Debde, you should tell you not there. You should do not there. That's on the puppet and Bashi Lamni, say, what the list, cousin.
Ale la so happy.
They did it. CJ Shiba did it. He would drink it. 지제 시바 참모서 sonda 가서
Okay.
나 건설을 어디서라다 다만 아주 지제 시바도 참모서 기분 링에 남샤도 참모서 되게 심부레스
So Geshe would first of all say that actually we didn't quite finish yet verse number 4, so which is pretty important. It is about the presentation of the individual with middling capacities. So we shall resume from here.
나야 당한조 가서 왔다 쳐서들 와 쳐서다 당고 쳐제 스베기 쳐데 되네 다 타바타베 쳐지제 슬라비야 타바타베게 탑제 다 탑시지 오 탐제게 뭐 타베게 탑시지 다 쳐제스나 다나가서 냠슬랑 냠니제 슬라데다 가리 냠슬랑 거라서나 타바타베게 되는 탑시디 냠니제 고야래 탐제게 뭐 타베게 냠니제 고야래 다 냠네 되지 뭐다 먼저 제 매라 제 고게 요만 되니디 제야 당하죠 제가 가산 디 나라네 다 기분 딩기 남샤의 시계 당당하죠 되네 가수라면 뱀바 시세지 값을 시작해야지 내가 어딜래 숨었어
First of all, when we speak about practicing the Dharma or the Dharma, then what is it actually referring to? It is referring to a method that will bring forth the attainment of liberation or full awakening, the state of omniscience. So that means that when we practice the Dharma, then it is because we are applying a tool that will bring forth the attainment of liberation or full Buddhahood, which would be full awakening or also called omniscience. So that's like the two do's, the two goals of the Dharma practice. And within this whole path of the Dharma practice, and especially then also referred to this text that we are talking about here, we arrived to the point to discuss the being of middling capacity. And within that topic, we left off at the point of the Four Noble Truths.
Yes, 다단다 가인스나 드레레스 고물루두게 가르송도스나 레다 뉴무 세베 타르 숨도스와 레다 뉴무 세베 타르스라 저 타베게 식 레다 뉴무 세로도 타르바레스 다 레다 뉴무 세베 타르바니나 아니 레다 뉴무 세데 세단 간디스게 레다 뉴무 세 다가세 게지 베낭 알아서 데레레제레 신기 동보를 샤샤나 신기 동보 당부 춘중게 되네 야처처처게 되네 바요 코라 gen고자 갈리갈레 매와 차두고 여러분 되네 전에 레가 녀몬 로다 되네레스 가인서 녀모데 게지 나마네 게지 치마 균두스가라 판도와게 되네 레가 녀모데 세드라게 되네 요르베스 근데 세도야 돼 말해서 레바 녀모세데 근데 싸우니네 세게 말해서 이네 세베 타지 요르데 세당 근데 세게 말해서 다 가레스도 녀빠도 안서 녀부게 고야르세 녀모데다 세게 다 람녀니 지고다 녀모 탑시 지고야르스 알레 담바티질라마
Re dinde kechi zo dogre se dinde sula gore. Ko rangshingi se gore rangshingi zo dogre vese.
Ale. Dinde kechi 딱 만나서 두주 조 줘야지 알아. 라신이 이런 님아 조는 선이 샤인게 선이 조서 난샤라 dinna 신자다 봐 두주 조 줘야지. 레다 뉴모데 남시 살아 알아서 미메즈 조 줘나 시제 조 줘야지 알아. 근데 누구요 말했어.
Shug magia betrogen.
네 버도
So the Indian master Nagarjuna has defined liberation in the following way. He said that liberation is the exhaustion of karma and affliction in Sanskrit. So then the question, of course, is, okay, how do we bring forth, how do we bring about the exhaustion of karma and afflictions? And some then think or wonder if karma and afflictions exhaust just by themselves, like, but mainly but how in a way how our lives exhaust, or in the way how a tree grows, that slowly from a seed a tree grows, then at some point it ages, and some point it dies. That is not how it happens, unfortunately. Karma and kleshas do not just exhaust by themselves because the time passes. That's not how it works. In fact, although there is an end to karmas and kleshas, there is also a remedy that needs to be applied in order to make them come to an end. And this remedy that we are talking about here is the so-called path, the Dharma path.
Seba dendalada nyumu seba de la tarbasula guyares. Nyumu sedrudu tal lega sedrugures. Nyumu sebe dogi le sedrugures. Kesi lega hamaji luba inayang ledel debu jiya yamare kanyisna o dila legin debu mimbar jabala nyumu sunde guyare sunde gengi nyumu de ha yamare nyumu de sesa.
Therefore, karma and kleshas do not just exhaust themselves on their own, by themselves. In fact, if one does not apply any kind of remedy, then karma and kleshas, they will just perpetuate themselves. And therefore, it is so necessary that we apply a remedy, because it's the remedy that will allow kleshas and karmas to stop, to persist, and to perpetuate themselves. And when all kleshas come to an end, then that is what is called liberation. And when all kleshas are exhausted, when they come to an end based on the remedy, then also karma will exhaust itself. There could be the case that still some remaining karma is left, but because there are no more kleshas to element that karma, then there will be no ripening of it. And for this reason, it is crucial that we apply the remedies, that we train in the remedies for afflictions and henceforth also karmas. So what is this? What are these remedies? These remedies are the four truths of the noble ones, or also commonly called the four noble truths. So there is no other way, there is no other skillful mean than this one. There's no other remedy than training in the four noble truths.
That Dunzen de Chinatang answers Pabe Dembashibu said D. Tanganazo Nambe Church here, that Drumshir Diris. Lord Nambe Church said it does. Nambe Church shed a mashi, Nambe Church Nyamsulangi Yedam said the Tamjeta, Tinshuto Lochangi to Middle Tires. Dembashito Lochangi, you know, Dene. Tinshin is the share get Tapshi. The net Ditola Lochane. Nyamni chicken duna. Then one is a number of chicken or number of Yamni chicken. Didn't tell me engage chicken duna. This all and Duguminduna. I cannot choose a chocolate to too much chicken or mother, chumani chicken or master.
The four noble truths are the very structure and at the same time foundation of all Dharma practices. So whenever we practice the Dharma, then it has to conform with this structure. It has to be based on the knowledge and on the support of the Four Noble Truths. It has to go into the direction of the Four Noble Truths based on them. And if that's not the case, then we might also practice the Dharma, but that would just be a fake Dharma practice, because it's not going to be a real Dharma practice if it's not in tune with the Four Noble Truths. Savadi.
가인스는 싸워도 머리바 차기도 오다 머리도 매버 소야게 탑들라 민지 대바시 장고도 대바시 나라네 토마르 동에 대바 장이래 토마르 동에 대바 로 장이도 동에 셔버 차 좀내 랑기 동에 셔버 차 군중방으로 차 고방원도 차 lam gombar cha sung re de kain sa dunge shabar cha sa re ni dunge gese kirang ge duden ge namsha de mishina ta karche ge dostla de kunjung pondang de shingi mare gobang do jegana shingi mare de mishina lam gondo je de yung ma da ya mar chana dunge shabar cha sa de geshim cha tomar.
We often hear talking about the cause of cyclic existence, the cause of samsara. And what is this cause for samsara? It is, in the first place, the afflictions, the kleshas, and in particularly the main klesha of all, which is the main cause of all cycling in cyclic existence, that would be ignorance or not knowing, a lack of awareness and knowledge, the right knowledge. And therefore we need, in order to remove this root of cyclic existence, we need to apply a remedy. And the main remedy is none other than the training in the Four Noble Truths, gaining knowledge in them, and then applying the tools, the practices of the path of the Four Noble Truths. So what are these Four Noble Truths? The first one is the noble truth of the truth of suffering. So the Buddha said concerning this truth, this is what is to be understood. This is what has to be known by you, by the practitioner. And the second truth is the truth of the origination of suffering, which the Buddha said clearly, this is what you have to give up. This is what you have to what you have to remove, what you have to give up. And the third truth is the truth of the cessation. And here the Buddha said that is what has to become manifested, what has to be actualized. And the last of the Four Noble Truths is the truth of the path, which the Buddha said, this is what you have to embark onto, and this is what you have to apply in order to bring cessation about. And therefore, it all starts then, of course, with the first of the Four Noble Truths, which is the truth of suffering. So if we don't understand the truth of suffering, then it is very difficult to abandon the causes of suffering. It is very difficult to, therefore, practice the second of the Four Noble Truths, which is the truth of origin of suffering, which is what is to be given up, and so on and so forth. So one truth relies on the other and on the next. So if the very basis is not understood, then it's very hard to proceed with the next ones.
Hi. Now, pejade ma shisha chala winda pejade, right?
Lasu.
Yeah, that this indeed the pabe demba shi lamni sta. Kaisna tamdu namgi kumje zodang. The pabe demba shibu de tarma degengi, chichigengi migita, nyamni chege zodi demba shi resungata. Tamdu nage, tamdu sila tarma devanangi. Kanza gomulurugu sonsuan, leda nyomo sebe tar sede ta tarbadi. Tarban deva namgi dini kumje zode kan deba shidire yesu gorda. 제조다 다 기본 딜을 샤샤바이나 기본 딩게 람게 다 슝신도 그랬어 슝신스나 기본 딩게 람냠이 지야가 람가가 쪼드랬어 람 쪼드랬어 거다
dann demashidi
대시라 로차야 돼
dann the kibu drinki lamkadi
기본 딩게 내가 없어 냠니 지야가 쪼드랬어 거다 기본 딩게 내가 없어 람기 슝신스라 저가인사 그냥 태바 침벽 가사기 냠슬라에 쪼데 가서 전죽습 세대 디첩디 기본 딩게 내가 없어 냠니 지야가 쪼데 가인스는데 딘시로 로자야 드레스 담바실로 로자야 드레스
And now, so continuing with this verse number 4, so we're talking about the individual of middling capacities, and in general, as was already said, a Dharma practitioner has to mainly really embody and apply the knowledge of the Four Noble Truths, and of course, if that individual wants to attain that kind of liberation that Nagarjuna talked about, right? So anybody who wants to attain liberation needs to rely on the Four Noble Truths, and especially now talking about the practitioner of middling capacities, especially for such an individual, the main practice will be that of the Four Noble Truths. So as you probably know, with an individual that practices of greater capacities, that would mainly have as a practice the bodhicitta mind, the mind of awakening. So here we're talking about an individual of middling capacities that will have as the main practice not bodhicitta, but the Four Noble Truths.
강보 동해 대마다 군주 대매당 되고 근데 양아 중이디
군중 당레 당 동일 덴바
동해 덴바 지다 제바이나 두상단에 되게 근데 양아 중이들라 주주당 제부주 상다 주주의 군주 덴바레 제부주의 동해 덴바레 하고서
네네
두스가 상타 인도가나 주주 데 군주 데메날 데수 제부주 데 동해 데메날 데수 자산한테 야나 중에 대한 대마시나 손들고도스 이나다 두즈디 셰고라 나라도 두다데 셰고야래 자산 주주 세데 군주 세데 동해 깨버지가 깨지기 교체기야래 도데데 군중게 데부샤고 단 데뷔치 독대인세 동행게 댐바세 독대인세데도 동행게 댐바세되게 나라죠 디견되게 통고야래
동행된 백견 통고래
동행된 백견데 통고야래 가인스는 다 동행된 백견되게 통바이나 동행들라 탄도그 삼바치 깨야다 라와야로 봐 동행들라 타르반 돼야지 동행들라 타론 돼야게 다 라와지야래
그래.
동해들라 동해이 봐 시고야. 동해이 봐 미시나 들라 탐대 직 말이야.
그래.
알아도 그러지라다.
그래. 얘나 엔텐데 얘나 truly di caragene share tanda kane trosondini.
내가 한선 디나 데치 베제디나 누가
네. 다디 냠술레 양키 디 케보딩키 디 리베.
디케보딩디나 따라래다. 파베 덴바시 람니 탄도 남게.
그래.
기분 되게 랑게 쇼신이 근데 야라 중이가 디도 뒤비치서 근데 야라 중이 돼 기분 딩기 값수 근데 야라 중이 돼 반제 조지게 알아 봐
반제 조레레레
반제 조지게 알아 저 강한 냠슬람 받을 때 기분 딩기 내가서 근데 야라 중이 빠야 돈달 지게 알아 근데 야라 중이 세도 돈다 되래 다 대바 당분이 되래 동네 대마다 군주 대마스 나
Consola di Javadi Yomarva?
consul di Yomare, Pace Yomare, the Ineta, can do the ladder consul tower the Yugirwa.
Lasso. So Geshe is drawing the explanations based on one commentary, which probably you do not have. You have the verses, that's not a problem. in any case, so what's coming up now in the commentary is that a individual of the middling capacities practices as the main part of the path the Four Noble Truths, and that also entails the abandonment of the 12 links of interdependent arising, because the 12 links of interdependent arising can be summarized into the first two Noble Truths. So, and are also equal with all Four Noble Truths at the same time. So how does it work? So the first Noble Truth is the truth of suffering. And the truth of suffering is reflecting 6 of the 12 links, which are the so-called resultant links. Resultant, why? Because suffering is a result of some causes that cause suffering. And the 12 links of interdependent arising, they are categorized in the so-called 6 links that are causal, causing a certain result, in that case that's suffering. And they have therefore also the other 6 resultant links. And the resultant links are therefore the truth of suffering, and the causal links are the truth of origination. So the truth of origination of suffering talks about the causes that bring suffering about, right? So therefore, the 12 links of interdependent arising can be also connected to the first 2 Noble Truths, the truth of suffering and the truth of the origin of suffering. So it is very important that we learn about the Four Noble Truths, because, for instance, so the very first one, the truth of suffering, talks about recognizing suffering, that we understand actually that suffering is something to be given up, that it is something faulty in a sense, that it's a state that we do not want to perpetuate. And it is so important that we recognize suffering as suffering, which is what the first Noble Truth entails, because otherwise we will never generate the wish to get free of suffering, to attain the so-called liberation. And therefore, the Buddha said, you have to understand what is suffering, and you have to understand, you have to learn how to recognize suffering. All of this then brought together in the first of the Four Noble Truths, the truth of suffering.
This one. That day young sa that tarban deva tarba doing start the letter numo said a tar seg tarban doing. Tarba said on the guasha with us, tarba not the church or church, tarbe church chigiorba. Koala tardo slagorba, jada tarba salade, letter numo said a tadela tarba slagiares. Then kinds na what alle 대담 지샤시던 정도 다 내야 되는 배 근데 인도선 땅 안쪽에 뗄라 가서 오다 미유디 가래서 타르바스 기분 중에 내가서 타르바스 미유디체 다데 되냐게 전도니제게 타르바 전도니야게 된 람데 때나 배장 때나 배윤도 가나 딱 가면서는 꾸는 유모초게 덴바스다 남자 초게 덴바스 누스가 책 니시 군장 니수 네데 슬라드 시게 그냥 배제도 질 딱이나 군장 니수 네데 슬라도아
알레오
시게 군장 니수 네데 슬라드 갈라고르스나 시게라 군중게 덴바스 가사 꾸는 유모초게 덴바스지다 남자 초게 덴바스 덴바시디 니기나 제시거다
비타하고 무슨 건다.
덴바시스 여러봐.
그래.
덴바시디 죽군중의 쟁게 제부 동해서 연구야 여러봐.
그래.
델라꾸는 유모초게 덴바스라 그래. 대니부들라. 그 람댕기 답게 제부 동해 가서 제부 과댕스 시기 여러봐. 고베 덴바스 제부 타르바스 시기 여러봐. 어들라 남자 초게 덴바스라 그래. 남버 장외. 가르쳐서 두군이의 장배 땜바데 고람니디 차기야래.
알레타 고페 뎀바탕 람기 뎀바 차소.
고베 뎀바다 람기 뎀바들라 남자 초게 뎀바스라. 동해 덴바다 군주 덴바다라 군은 유모 초게 덴바스라
알레하고소.
어즈가 고니세 군샤니스 녜데스 라던데레
딘데다 터니르체네 건조기.
당아주 두스가르 체네 시레레 마 라비에 가인세 천은 동문에지 셰 탑시치기스 나도다 책나로 두즈름 거 쉬우시대 책내지도 야고저 마셔봐이나 땡아주 쇼냐면 지당한테 신기야 말이야 쇼냐면 지당 마셔봐이나 땡아주 답에 가서 된다 무시대 파샤 된도 와지게 가르소를 천사 쉬우시 다 몽대 쇼 쉬우시 조대디야 봐 어디 마용 쳐도다 시레레기 된다다 마셔야 탑시치기야 그래서
그래.
다 군장님수 네바 세대 시대니 키라서 하고 왔지야스 군은 너무 쇼게 담바 스직스 러고도 남자 쇼게 담바 니 데네니 랍송 데마시데 되기는 데스 랍송 군은 너무 쇼게 담바스 가래 슬라도 주 군중라 되는 제부 동행게 남샤 중화되라 군은 너무 쇼게 담바 러고도다 다드네 그 남게 덴베다 제분 과된게 남샤 중화되라 남장 초게 담바스라 그도다 알리 남샤 데 셰고야 스라
레타디 람라예나 딘데 람라예나 디 예와디 차고레베 람라예나 디 케차디 람카 케차마르와 람캅 케차
레레 다 디 페제나 디 라고도 안다 군작 슬롱다
레레 타하고 손디기레라
어디슬라다
Okay, so we saw that Nagarjuna explained liberation to be the state where all afflictions and karmas have exhausted, have come to an end. And this kind of liberation is the aim of an individual of middling capacities, as is explained in verse number 4. And now there was the explanation concerning several terms. So this kind of individual we have seen practices mainly the Four Noble Truths. And so there are various ways of categorizing or talking about the Four Noble Truths. And one other way of concising them is to talk about in one term. So I'm sorry, but I'm not sure in English what's the standard term here. If there exists one, is a little bit long in Tibetan. So there is like two aspects of, again, categorizing the Four Noble Truths, which are putting the first two into one aspect, one group, and then the last two aspects. So the first one is the aspect of the truth of suffering and the truth of origination of suffering, which is what is to be given up through understanding what is suffering, recognizing suffering, and then applying the antidotes of suffering. So this is the first aspect when we bring them together, the Four Noble Truths into two. And the second aspect is where the truth of the path and the truth of cessation are brought together, which are what is to be practiced and to be accomplished, and the result itself, which is the truth of cessation. And it is very important that you know these various distinctions and that you actually gain thorough knowledge in the Dharma. And this is also why Geshe-la is being very accurate in here, taking each term in Tibetan and explaining it to me. And then I'm trying to do the same for you as much as I can, because it's really important that you get a thorough understanding of the Dharma, because these days what happens a lot is that there is not a thorough study or a thorough application, and on either side, could be the practitioner, could be a teacher, and then we have the occurrence of a lot of blind faith, which is not really, which can be, shattered very easily or scattered very easily. So therefore, for Geshe-la, it's very important that we get a thorough understanding of the Dharma as much as we can, so that we can really apply in an accurate and authentic manner with a correct understanding the Dharma practice.
Today you do that there, Tambulas, you change your Kunjung Dambas, to the Kunjung Dambares, Lamreda, to the Kunjung Dambares, Jebuchimba, the Dungang Dambares, Lam. To the Kunjung Dambare, Jebu the Dungang Dambares, what? Tambo the Ninja.
Retanda kune nyamong
어 저게 담바들라 군에 요모 저게 담바들라 죽군중 다 가인스라 주들라 군중 담발라고 야로 디 제부칭 바데 동행이 담바스라고 야래 이니수냐 말레스 다 치마 다 남자 저게 담바들라 단데 가사 치마라다 과된다 탑지 람네 니수냐 말레스 다 된다 담바 시도 못해 지기야래 치마라 탑자 과데레스 탑지 람네레스 와데당 람데니레 니수냐 말레스 하고서 내 구림데 간데레스나 토마르스 동해데마 송바레스 문에 전에 담군주데마 송고야레 지어데 이네데마 송자 좀데 데게 동해셔버 차서 담모데 송바레스
네
아데 데 가인스나 담보 동해셔버 차 소야지 직당 대저수 군주 방어차 데네 제분 과된데 타버 뭔데 자고 그레스 디 뭔데 자에가 자와라 된 람공고 그랬잖아 된 람데디 줄었어 주디 제라서 제부도 뭐라서 말해 딘nen가 지어렸어 nen가 가서 냠링기 좀 받질라 자단 두고 야랬어 와 아디 질라다
그래 단다 디기 남샤델라 야 알로기 암네시다 So when we talk about these categorizing the Four Noble Truths into two aspects, then actually the order of the Four Noble Truths as they were explained by the Buddha is a little bit different. So how is it with these, when we bring them into two aspects, then the first aspect, which talks about the state of affliction of sentient beings, starts with the cause. So that would be the truth of origination, which is the truth that talks about what causes suffering, right? The truth of origination of suffering. And then the second part of the first aspect is the truth of suffering, which is the result of the first. Coming to the second aspect, then we see that the first point is, sorry, let me just check. Is the truth of cessation that remains the same, which is what is to be attained. And then last, the truth of the path, which is what brings that attainment about. And therefore, then it's a little bit, one could wonder, strange, why is the order of the first two reversed when the Buddha definitely explained first the truth of suffering and not the truth of origination. The Buddha first said, you have to understand and recognize suffering. And then he said, you have to give up this and this and that so that you remove the causes for suffering. And then the Buddha didn't speak first about the cause of the path, which would lead us to freedom from suffering, but he talked about the truth of cessation, which is what we have to accomplish. And then in the last point, he said, what is the cause for this accomplishment? What is the cause, the so-called Dharma path? And therefore, one could wonder, even as one hears this, like, why did he choose such an order? And it was not random, but indeed it shows the steps of the path of practice.
Yes, huh? Yeah, that's it. 당한테 두 사람 당고 다스. 아. 나 동행기 덴바스 간데 쉐긴베스. 당고들라.
간데 쉐긴베스.
동행 덴바스라 간데 상무 간데 시당긴베스. 다.
간데 케체트야르베.
말해. 지당 알아줘 다 두스가 라였다.
그래서.
그럼 다 동행 덴바스라 간데 동행 덴바라고 야래 슬라인데 동행게 덴바스 지당 알아도 세시를 문제잖아. 나라도 수고. 나라도 풍부하고 될라 동행 덴바스 문제지. 속의 풍부, 소의 풍부 도시 나바시베 풍부지네. 풍부하고 될라 동행 덴바스 문제지. 좋아? 근데 동행 덴바 예배 시고야. 네 동행 덴바 시발라. 네 동행 덴바 예배 캐주시디 시고. 캐주시. 캐주시디 마셔나 그 동네데 뭐 이마 셰투고요 말다.
Mhm.
제상 안아서 풍부디 토마를 믿어봐 이마 셰고요. 니바들 둥나와 이마 셰고요. 숨바들 되는 다 된다 가야 똥왔을라고요. 딱지랑 어제게 똥왔을라고 다들 그냥 랍두고요. 두고 딱지랑 어제게 똥왔을라고요. 다 시바들라 가라서는 다 매바슬라고요. 다 매바스 랍윤데 가나 들려 타라 망고 치인 거야. 참여원도 제바나 랑신기 모두 봐. 다 랑신기 모두 봐. 랍삼 되기도 다.
Da super chason shiba chason kietu.
계주 시바디.
Somebody dak tongpa dak chigram wachingi tongpa.
다지랑 어제 동화데 숨바디제. 니바도 동나와데. 당보데 미다바디제.
아니 shiba.
시바잖아. 다 랑원에 두고 동바.
Rangune drupa tongpa.
랑신기 동바.
Rangshingi tongpa das.
어디 나한테 풍봉한 것도 다 랑신기 동바인데 다 없을라고요. 싫어인 거 가서 어디나 시잖아.
What do we think, what comes first to mind when we hear, okay, the truth of suffering, to recognize suffering, what comes to mind? And what this actually entails is the 5 skandhas. So the 5 skandhas, which are our body, feelings, perceptions, formations, and consciousness, they are the truth of suffering. They are suffering. And why do we know that they are suffering? Because they have 4 characteristics, which are the characteristic of being impermanent. They are suffering, which is the second characteristic. The third one is that they are empty of an individual existing on his own term self. And the fourth characteristic is that they have no inherent existence.
Yes, sir. That the share in the Ganatanga, didn't the Shibayana? Kunju Temba said the Poyage, Lam to get the shed water.
Kunjung dembe lamka shingire.
Kunju Temba Kandis Pangures.
Ale kandis pangure.
Kunju Temba Carres the shed. Kunju Temba Paya Yora Yamares the shed. What is Tabia Yoda, mess the shed. Lamdins the Gomna Yadra Yeda mess the shed. Jada Sama to make them back out 2 days. To make them make cage digging on that cage Tama. Tombadi, Rangsing Tombadi, said they got 2 days.
And therefore, this very first of the 4 noble truths is the crucial one which enables all of the other. And when we understand the first noble truth, the truth of suffering inherent to the 5 skandhas and so forth, then we also understand easily what it is that is to be given up. So therefore we will understand the second noble truth, the truth of origination. And we will therefore then also understand that it is possible to achieve so-called cessation, which is the third of the 4th noble truth, and we will understand that there is a path that leads towards this. So all of this is rooted in the first of the 4 noble truths. Di rangshingi tongba dichi kandachi kande di shira tanda lapshe maso.
Aya the nya kalikale labi. Ma di nam chat labi. This one.
Lazo.
Yeah. Ta dangbo dinin du salta. Peracha shabayina. Midaba sa salta yindu. Nanzu midabe tolo komyagu ji gaba yindu. Gaba yina. Ta kayinsran midabe tolo salta ba dela tene. Ta karchage resana nanzu sendi mizidi takpan zingiya maradanda. Tangzi kanzanji dodo yare. Tadi karchage resana nanzu 인지 미지 깨와 치머질 상당토에 차르고요. 미다바스를 계시모 쉬우지 차버 당보. 미다베 돌 공제한테 쉬우지 계시모 차래. 다 미다바스 미다베 돌 내주도 야고 쉬버자. 뒤돌아 공제거이나 난저 라운드에 쳐로 준주제지 인물에.
준주제기를 얘기래요.
쳐로 준주제기다. 춘념이 제일 다 난저 당다버 춘년에 야고 쳐모도 가는 하버서 미다와 마고마지를 하대요. 계저 당보라 계저 당보라는 가셔면서 세대 딱바라데 딱바란 진지로 난저 셈난 강이랍지 니마레레 나와 소소소 셈난 지나 강이랍 담마다 체대데 강이스나 그네 용거 그 미다발 상당요 말들이 나라도 미지 디게 나가 참메셰 참마데 나저 그 시부지다 미수베 참망고 줘야 돼 나저 미다발 상당요 말들이 제세 나저 미다발 상당 바이나 나저 껴 상을 가서 니가 예전에 껴와 치면 가지고 그래. 치면도 상당 퇴지 그래. 세디 로당 퇴지 그래. 처번 남다 저게 센데 로당 투고야 봐. 당고 치워라 지고지고 그랬어. 타마 치워들 민지고지고 그래라고 야 봐.
당보 치와라 지고레스 네미
뭐 지금 원수도가 치워라 지고 치워라 지내다 쳐져야 탑시 지고야 래. 나 주년에 야고 저 다 치워라 민지게 차도고야. 근데 다 가에서는 고개와 치마를 소소 야한다 봐준 거야. 저리 삼아 제사 다 됩니다. 하고서
레레 당보 치와라 셰네로 아냠렌체 아니 제라 치와디 제마톱네로
다 치워 좀 두고요. 다 소소 좀 두고요. 걔가 소소를 탑두고야. 얘도 다 세고야 뭐다. 겨와 동안도 경과를 찾아 추념이 하고 제는 겨와 치마도 돌아 들레 경과 들레 겨와 치면 밀루 사바지 레나데 야도 와서지 그런 라원리 인 거야.
네.
저는 처음 난다 저 당고 치워라지. 근데 타마 치워라 민증이 차고야. 난도 가인스는 다 가르쳐도 처남다 주마도 간데 뭐다 미다바 도 살마도 반다 살타마도 반디 랑을 하지 돼요. 그래서
네. And these four characteristics that were just mentioned, which are part of the first of the Four Noble Truths, are also exactly with this importance that they will enable us and give us the wish to actually go further, to really apply what the Buddha taught and to really apply to give up the origination of suffering and so forth and so on. And therefore, when we thoroughly understand and study, learn about impermanence, and then meditate about it, then what happens is that the strong clinging that we have at present towards the present life will start to loosen up a bit and until it dissipates. And then we will also start to think, when we stop clinging so much onto this life, we will start to think about future lives. And then we will start to consider means that will actually support us to go somewhere fruitful, somewhere meaningful. So we will start to become really interested in the practice itself. We will start to develop diligence and joyful effort in the Dharma path. Why is it that we have such a hard time to practice the Dharma in the first place, to be consistent with it? It all starts because we are not focusing on this first point of impermanence enough. We are not really considering it enough yet. We haven't embodied it enough. So that we are still holding very much onto this present life. And all the troubles, that we experience in our daily lives, all the difficulties, the struggles that we go through is because we are not considering and thinking about impermanence enough. We are not busying ourselves enough with this kind of thought. All inauspicious events and so on and so forth in our lives, they are due to us not pondering about impermanence enough. And in fact, when we do start to really contemplate on impermanence more and more, then there will arise a lot of power and energy for us to really think about the future, about future lives, and so on and so forth. And this is how we will start to, in a way, let go, be able to let go of this life, which is what a Dharma practitioner will achieve at some point, to be able to let go of this life. It's not that important. And there's also a little bit the same about the contemplation with death. You know, they say at first you have to start to fear death, so then you will, you know, be concerned and do something about it. And that will actually lead you to really applying means that will enable you to gain full freedom over the moment of death. That will give them a new mindset to the practitioner, and insight where the practitioner will actually say, oh, how nice, I can finally leave this body behind. It's old, it's decayed, I can take a new one.
Those got me that was something the quarter matachi, Lenya Poya Tapshit, the less some would do a Tapshit in our Midava Sunday, the Yampanda. Oh, the Midava Sunday turned out the caress, no? Oh, Shimo Dungan, Shimeki Carso Dungan Yomogage, you Dungan Yongage led the papa. Shimo Sandwich you a touch of what you what the sort of what you got, Midava Sound somebody. Yeah.
In other words, contemplating about impermanence and death is really the source for all our confidence in practicing the Dharma and willpower. And when now these examples were given about death and not fearing death anymore and so on, it's not, you know, in the way that somebody with wrong beliefs and so on says, I'm going into war for this and that cause, and I'm not afraid of death. You know, that's not what we are talking about here. This is another fearlessness of death, a fearlessness coming out of an authentic knowledge and an authentic confidence from within, because one has practiced virtue and given up the roots for suffering. So authentic Dharma practitioner becomes fearless of death because he or she have cultivated so many skillful means and accumulated virtue and given up negativities that they know they will gain a positive rebirth, and therefore they are not afraid of death. So this is a very different kind of fearlessness of death that we are talking about here. So giving up, this kind of practitioner leaves the life behind in the sense of giving up, clinging to this life and to only goals that are concerned to this life, and focuses on the future. And that's how fearlessness of death is gained. So we see that all of this actually has the very root in the contemplation and the understanding of impermanence and dying. truth of death and impermanence and so forth. So that is actually what will cause in us the wish to start accumulating positive karmas, to do positive virtuous deeds, and to give up anything that causes negativities, that causes suffering, kleshas, and so forth. So we see that without all of this very first step in the truth of suffering, which is impermanence, that very step leads us to do anything in the first place, to give us the wish to accumulate virtuous deeds and give up negativities.
lenyo de pongengi kansachi what it is shine the midaba gombe ge den ara zo ge midaba gombe ge da pain of the chagi
And therefore, why is it so much stressed to meditate on impermanence? Because that's what will reverse our clinging and attachment to this very life and to only goals in this life, and to focus on something that's bigger, that's going beyond. And that's how we will get the wish to do something positive and meaningful with this life, to plant a lot of seeds and do a lot of actions that will bring positive karmas about, virtue. And also at the same time, of course, then the wish to give up any negativities, to stop planting new seeds for new negative karmas and more afflictions. So all of this, as we see again, is rooted in the contemplation about impermanence.
다들 개진여바 시시다. 개진여바도 둥나와 세셔인데 둥나와서 코안데 둥나와라는 시도 상땅고 코안데 둥에게라는 시죠 상땅이도 딱 가르쳐도 둥에게라는 시죠니나 너밖에 말라게라.
둥에 가르기 너밖에 말이?
둥에게라는 시죠이 봐 셰바이나. Dela soso döbe döba kimara, döcha kimara, dela döcha kimara.
Aledi korvala döcha.
Koala chaba dodu yarba. Jaza koala chashin doya de dunga veranshi samgores. Koala dunga veranshi samba yena, koala shimba loya yungures. Koala tarim döbe deni, tarba döbe deni, samba deni gozo yungures. Jaza nganzo ninjunga samba sa dere. Kwa dungenge ranshin chen yinba je, sanlo tangche, ngunege dungenge ranshin chen yinba she yundu, ta tarba se dondo nyege samba je shini gigi yor, dela ninjung simsila wiyare. Cheza nga zo daga se ninjung simsila, o danga rikanto wa dega dhugi ninjung ge isi, di ge je mare isi. O nga tsamraj deje jina zuide ge isi, dela ninjung ge sigi ya mare. Nga la dowa kaka moga, nga la kaya moga tanga di ninjung chigi isi, dine geje mares. Katamba giwe shiye na mimang nalol deje. Ninjung samba dine lo changi yares.
Mimang nalol dine.
Jeta ninjung sinsa de, kwa dungenge ranshin shen ba tong, kwa dungenge ranshin shen ba tane, de kwa dungenge ranshin shen ba tong arja, de la lo be samba ke gu yare. De la ninjung sinsa dila gu yare.
Die Kadamba Geshe ki tapshi dindere vela.
Kadamba Geshe tapshi dindere.
And then there is the second aspect. So let's talk about that. The second characteristic of the truth of suffering, which is the characteristic of suffering. And what is this referring to? This is referring to the nature of cyclic existence, which is suffering in itself. So it's asking the practitioner to contemplate about the nature of cyclic existence and to understand, until the practitioner fully sees it with their own eyes, that cyclic existence, samsara, is the nature of suffering, that suffering is all pervasive. And that itself, this characteristic, the contemplation, meditation about suffering, will then cause us to reverse, to turn away from clinging onto samsara, onto cyclic existence. And therefore we will get the wish to get free from samsara, to attain liberation from samsara. It starts here. It starts by understanding that samsara is not a paradise, and indeed it's the complete opposite. It is pervaded by suffering. It is a state of suffering. And that's also then where the word renunciation comes about, which is often misunderstood. Renunciation, what is it actually in reality, in the real meaning of it? So it's very interesting to look at the Tibetan word nge jung, means actually to gain certainty. So this is just my addition for you to know. It means to gain certainty or gaining of certainty. And in English then it's coined, or in Western languages, as renunciation. And what is the certainty that is gained here? It is the certainty of understanding, the certainty that samsara is suffering, and therefore the wish to gain liberation out of samsara. So renunciation is the wish to become free, because we have understood that samsara is not the place to be in on a long term. It's a place of suffering. So that's what the term really means, renunciation. And it's not, oh, I am renunciating the world, I'm going into a cave, or I am retreating into the woods because I am going to generate renunciation, or saying, I don't need anything, I don't need any possessions or anything else because I am going to develop renunciation. This is not really what renunciation means. In fact, Geshe says that many Kadampa Geshes, they actually did what they did to develop renunciation was they stayed in the midst of people, in the midst of the worldly happenings, so that they could truly understand the nature of suffering in samsara by observing, by reflecting, and being very precise in their observations.
자와다 아니 지겐도 잡아서네다 아니 속에서 나 인종계 탑시 제가 누구 있으라고요.
예중계 탑시 책이 있어.
아 탑시 책이 있으나 다 자와다 아니나 죽여요.
네.
라 심어나 오 자와다 아니래서 다 보니 하람지 야다 와라지 임바들 상을 남냐 던지요 말이야. 그 탑시 책이요 봐. 야그 탑시 책이나 죽여요. 내 어디 야보래. 시마도 그 탑시 제 사배서를 상당히요 말이야. 하고서
리타디 차직탕 딘데 켐바 짬킹아 니중계 송세네.
제가 잡아지긴 바라 쳤으나 어떻게 잡아지기도 있어. 잡아래샤스라 지금 잡아지는 데 교촌 매에서 된 남녀 싸우던 겨 말이야. 그 잡아지야 돼. 그 교포야 있어도 잡아지게 얼마다 지게 그 교포 사이즈 잡아줘도 말아 봐. 나 교포 사이즈 아니 잡아게 말아 봐. 아 저다 아니 제다 나 교포에 탑시 지긴 있으나 봐 죽여 없어.
그래.
뭐 근데 이제 자동관에서 민주주의계 그 탑시 지긴 이렇게 독일에다 내 가시 그 토양 탑시 지기서 봐 죽여.
그래서
this not that,
And in the same way, you shouldn't think, I am going to develop renunciation and therefore to renounce, I will become a monk or a nun. That's not what it is about. Becoming an ordinate, taking ordination as a monk or a nun is because that itself is a tool. That is a tool to develop renunciation. It's not an outcome. So you should never think like that taking the ordination means, or somebody who's ordained is free from faults. In fact, if they were free from faults, there would be no need to do so many things. But they are taking the ordination itself is a tool. It's a way to actually practice renunciation, to familiarize and embody renunciations, to train in renunciation. And if then somebody succeeds, whether they succeed or do not succeed, I don't know. But ordination is a way to train in giving up negativities.
어디네 상담 주제. 나드네다 코 동네게는 시장에 봐도 skara sangtanje da koala shemba loye ge tabshi chakure sra koade panye ge koala kyendo tonje panye ro da koa se de dungen ge pumbu chembu dis saje nyorle be pumbu de midabe ranshira takwa mare de chashe mango shibu chila tenen jungare 어디 라원진도 줘봐마래 교단 깨나 떠봐래 그래서 딱지 라원진 똥봐래 세도 누스를 산다는 거야. 제자 다 가야스나 갈라 간상게 꼭 디네바 슈치를 심바래. 단지 당고 미다바치라 산다. 디네 동아웨 납시치라 산다. 디네 딱봐 말에다스. 어 차셰 갈라 마도베 지우와 말에다스. 어 교단 깨라 떠봐진래다. 슬라도 가나 땡중토라 갈라 간상 산다데 누구도 와.
텐중.
땡중토라. 다시 라원진 똥아래 슬라도 고 디다나 딱고 민중 삼바의 야제 땅에 슈처를 주고 다 삼바의 슈처를 땅인 거. 다 냠니도 슈처를 땅인 거. 로중 세르도 로중 누가도 슈처를 땅인 거.
Right. Yeah, so that's good that you are aware of what was mentioned, and therefore here with the second point of suffering, it is about understanding that the nature of samsara, the nature of cyclic existence, is suffering, and therefore it is also something to abandon. And therefore, if we think about the various characteristics that are part of the truth of suffering, then they are like levels or steps to increase our understanding, to increase the capacity of renunciating, to train the mind in a greater and greater way. So, for example, let's take this body of ours, this compiled piece of skandhas, of various skandhas, which is a so-called defiled state, a state which is made of defilements, which means it's not free from suffering and so forth. So this body of ours is indeed, when we think about impermanence, it's not permanent. And therefore we start with the first point. This body is not something permanent, it decays and so forth and so on. And then it is also the nature of suffering. And at the same time, it is compiled of many parts, which means that it cannot have one single identity that we would call a self or an I, because there is no one piece to be found that is its inherent constitution. And that also then entails the fact that it cannot be inherently existent, because it is made of many causes and many conditions, of many, many different parts, which then are assembled to make the whole that we perceive as a whole. And therefore you see that that's also already very much relating to dependent arising. It's already coming through the tone, the vibe of that. And in that way, it's going, like the investigation is getting deeper and deeper with every step, and therefore also the mind training, the power and the tools for developing renunciation and so on are deepening.
자기도 신으로 장원이 쪽에 똥바니 세지가 내는 거다. 다다 풍분이가 내가 소리 예봐도 다다 풍분이래. 다다 풍분이가 다 랑식이 똥바래. 와? 다 간이서 띵종래 땡내 중앙. 그러면 띵종 장장 계셔서 그 땡내 중에 치르스. 슬라드다 중간 내가 전부 휴식한 토지 계시기로 해.
Kare tangi di koma sikoma so mare daktam pumbu nika di kare chaso ngatsugi jintanso
다 풍분이가 다 장원에 쪽에 똥바래스.
야야 di hago so 야야 이네 di ngatsu kare ngatsu so
다 장원에 쪽에 똥바인데 똥바인데 군산 간스다 띵종레.
di hago 야 직송나 계실라. So because the truth of suffering entails impermanence. Because something is impermanent, it is also the nature of suffering. And that then further entails that there is no single identity, there is no true independent self or entity in all of that. And that all further entails that there is no inherent existence of phenomena. And you see that that already actually leads towards the understanding of emptiness. Empty of an inherent existence. And therefore, one can say, so in our case as individuals, we're talking about the self and the skandhas that constitute our self, our idea of self. So these are, in other words, empty of a true nature, of an inherent existence, of an independent entity or self. Because they are, it follows that they are interdependent, that they arise based on interdependent arising. So you see that we are getting actually to a very deep, a very big topic here.
다다 부모님보다 정신이 마주베 균전을 가르고 있는데 띵중님이 쳤을 거게 거기. 셴라 때는 중스라도 라와도 민도. 라왕게 줘봐. 라왕을 줘봐. 유경원의 수두샤에 제 민도. 안 근데지 임바예는 유딘의 수두샤에 제네. 라왕 줘봐면 사마 셴라 때는 용거 여봐예는 때는 종아지면 임바예는 안 안으로 편에 여봐 넘기도 가래스티.
Naja, die Kaderese.
나도 사마 편에 주셔 버리는 것도 더 가르쳐졌어.
So we are actually, I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Tibetan form of debate. So Geshe is kind of quoting the syllogisms here, and basically the logic goes then as follows. So we're talking about the self and the skandhas. So the self and the skandhas, they arise out of the principle of dependent arising or dependent origination, which is why they cannot have an inherent existence. So this is because this. So if this is, then this always must be. So that's in a way how the syllogisms work, right? So let me just repeat this again. Because something is the nature of dependent arising, so comes about based on causes and conditions, it cannot have an inherent existence. It cannot have an independent self because it is born out of interdependent origination. It is dependently arising. So whenever something is based on something else to exist, whenever something is dependent on something else to come about, then we can never talk about an inherent mode of existence. Is not possible. There is not such thing whenever causes and conditions are involved, in other words. So then, of course, it's weird. So how is it possible that everything is based on interdependent arising, but still we see everything? It's like things are there, right? They manifest. So how is it possible? What is this?
당 고물로도 됐음래. 레당 녀모 남도레스. 대다 저당 저바고. 동바니도 가버 교루스 말해. 동바니긴 가버 교루스.
Okay, Yankia.
레당 녀모
남도레.
남도레 중도스. 남도레 중화데.
알레 나가데죠.
대다 뱀참 만다장 가서 남기도 왔어.
그래.
차사지 그 차사 편에 수 주셔서 짱짱이 넘기도 왔어.
Really.
디 남도 줘봐 짱냐래 남도 줘봐 디 동반이 선다 단지서 다다 풍부를 땡중님의 경쟁의 다다 풍부 런신주가 동부도의 로디 답기 동료도의 실업 될라 때네 대탐정 가도 그죠 동반이든 가버리죠.
Really. Dagtan pungbo rangshingi tongpa tokpa latene.
되게 남도 디 남도 줘봐 대탐정 가도 그랬어. 내가 남도 줘봐 대탐정 가도 그랬어.
Lasso. So Nagarjuna answered the problem or our dilemma in the following way. He said, all of this, all the manifold appearances that are determining our existence, our present state that we are in, they arise out of karma, afflictions, and discursive thoughts, concepts. These are nothing, all these appearances are nothing but fabrications of the discursive mind. And when we understand that this so-called self, this identity that we think truly exists, this I, this me, when we understand that the skandhas are actually empty of an own inherent nature, then all fabrications of the mind, of this discursive thinking, of our concepts, they dissipate, they cease.
맞아요. 나도 그래. 제가 다 타만 가래서는 나라도 나와 탐제 대바르게 남대에게 남도 그 저바 대탐제 나라도 셈기 춘인기 셈기 나라도 그 셈스랑 나라도 실업되게 동반이데 현주데 셈기 춘이데 현주데 다 셈기 춘이데 현주데 오다 간 나왔는데 때모도 삼다 단다바도 나라도 대왕도 친자 레사게 도 답베데 녀라 참아 되네랑게도 어디게 참아 동반이도 가도 그랬어. 내가 타르바스라고 그랬어. 타르바 남도 그 레다 녀모가 남도 그 저바 탐정 가봐 생기취 생기 런신도 막 가도도 타르바스라고 그랬어. 타르바도 치료를 내 무슨 그냥 생기 셈랑 나와나 타르바스레스.
Really.
집대행이 교회가 타마 센도도 타르바스 차례로.
Really. So therefore, when based on the support of wisdom, through wisdom we realize the true nature of phenomena of the mind, the true nature, the so-called Dharma Dhatu. When we understand this, when we fully realize the nature of things, then all of these appearances that we thought were really existent, that were so true, then they dissolve into emptiness. They come to cease in the state of emptiness, in their true nature. And in fact, it is this very thinking, this conviction that whatever we experience right now is so true, it's so truly existent, that causes us all our troubles. And therefore, when we understand the true nature of things and this clinging onto a real, truly established experience, when this dissolves into emptiness, then we achieve so-called liberation. Then these fabrications, they pacify these illusionary perceptions.
과 삼사라서 되게 나와라. 동행기 림바 제셔지다. 동행기 림바 죽셔지다. 동행기 림바 숨셔지다. 다 되네 용되죠. 너나 과 지동에서다. 과 란소소의 동에서라. 되게 내저 마고 쉬쉬 용되게.
알레.
대탐제 가라에서는 동반이긴 가버렸어. 동반이 또 실업 뒤다고 대탐제 세도 그랬어. 대탐제 빠도 그랬어. 님부 되게고 딱 나도 대체도 된다고 동방이는 디셰가 저번 나도 저걸로 좀 제고야. 냠니 가이는 디네들이 셰도 냠니 제고야. 나라도 차 저기 있는다. 꼬라라 시작이 있는다. 머니지 정게 있는다. 간도 가르치기는 그런 그 practice를 가르치기는 그 탐제 동리도 배터서로 짱짱 시고야. 동리도 와야겠지도.
So there are various classifications of the kinds of suffering that one can experience in samsara. Sometimes they speak about 8 stages or 6 or 3. And for example, just to give you an idea, that could be the so-called collective suffering, or that could be the individual, personal kind of suffering. And all of these, however many you want to gather and label, all of them, when we realize emptiness, or let's say, in other words, through the wisdom that realizes emptiness, they get all pacified. They are all abandoned, given up at once. And that's why this is the remedy that we want, the wisdom that realizes emptiness. And for the sake of this, we study. For the sake of this, we practice. Whatever you practice, whether you're reciting a mantra, doing a kora, making prostrations, these have all the purpose of realizing emptiness.
다양한 소양들을 다. nga tongni to ya ge chodo mani sagi nga jangi de doji simbe komde jigi da nga be a de ne cha chege ni de ne mende sagi da ji tongni to ya ge chodo jigi yes. Yine tongni ge tola toba da samba da gomba ma jena. De kanya je de kira mezi de zoa je de ni kira kaya mengen cha grista. Sunam de da sando kabre de yine ngui nezi de kira mengen cha ngi.
Tak Tonila yang tösam gom sum chegore segore.
소 동일아 저상 무슨 체. 그 현다도 정말 연락이. 소도 동바이로 저상 무슨 체죠. 다소 수수가 냠냠도 롭존치야 다 저상 고송 체도 동바인데 체. 현다 practice 현다 강이바 예제다 뒤 연락을 들어로 watch是吧?我뒤 탑스 드라이스 탑시 체고 마다잖아. 나 현다도 조지 제 동님 더 저상 고서 제도 조 맞아 봐 얘는 내가서 배 누트리션으로 거다. 나도 타마들아 메시지 되게 바라 메시지 조지 가야 되는 차로다.
But we should not misunderstand the following. So we should not think that it is enough to do all kinds of practices like repeating a mantra, prostrating, doing Vajrasattva mantras, and so on, without also studying and reflecting and meditating about emptiness. So actually, the main part of our practice is study, reflection, and meditation about emptiness. That's the main part. And all these other things, the practices that we do, they are like branches. They are the branches of the center, the focal point, which we should not forget. Otherwise, yeah, we might do good things. We might accumulate some good karma, have some positive seeds, but it's not going to lead us really to where we want to go. So the focal point is really at the center, the contemplation, the study, and the meditation about emptiness.
코아스의 강과지를 매숙 첨부 쇼고 좀 바탕인다고 상당스.
네, 숙첨부직.
네.
알레메.
매숙 첨부 좀 바다이나 캄바데나 다 그런 비기쇼 누구 말아? 캄바데쇼는 맨 바르사 캄바데는 저 누구 말아다. 제가 코아데 드네지 따와이나 이 코아들 셔발로 주고 그래서 왔다. 직제 야나 정강럽 정강 두자 쉬우지 코드 정강 두자 쉬우지 다 들려 누가 매고 정강 두실 되는 상담 봐이나 약해는 되는 런도 지금 알았어 직제 야나 걔는 자수 신부시 나라베 출럽다 다 쉬우지 다 그런 배드 추게 야고 자마신 미지다 피난 런도 지금 알았다 다 신앙 도스로 추게 신에 다 가고로 왔대
네.
제가 수연 런도 지금 알아 다 들 근데 상에 야는 림바숨제송 림바시다 딱 되게 보도와 림바시송도 다 사자 지나 남다 쉬고지 요새 사자지 사자 동바지 수수주군 로야 너바 수지 지금 알아 어 데라 첸센 리다긴 신앙사부 찍도 다다 색당 찍도 두당 담바다도 세로 야나 쿠마 작바마 테나 망고 쉬우도 세 소라다 워든데게 되니 되게 사자지 냠나we 사자 되지 임바이나 어들라 추문도 칼라라고 말했지는 수준으로 지금 말하더라 제가 가서 코아들 심발로다 되지로에 탑시죠 그래서 계속 보도 다 되는 순도
The Bodhisattva Putowa, so the master Putowa from past Tibet, he gave some helpful advices or tools to how we can turn the mind away from samsara, to how can we truly renunciate samsara. So he says that there is a way how we can think of samsara that actually really helps. So some metaphors or examples. And one is that imagine samsara to be like a very strong fire. Like you would never go in the midst of that fire or jump into the fire. Who would do that? Nobody would. So think like of samsara like a huge fire pit or something like that. And that will really bring forth the renunciation of samsara and turning away from the attachment towards samsara. Another example he gives is think of samsara as the worst prison that you can imagine, like the worst of all worst prisons. Like you would never want to go there. And that's another helpful image. And the third one he gives is think of samsara like being a huge, wild, dangerous ocean, and you cannot swim. You would never, ever think of going in the midst of this ocean. And the last one is, he says, think of an empty plain, for instance, which is really a very fearsome place, haunted by spirits, by wild animals, by serpents and snakes and robbers, by soldiers. You would never want to go there or stay there. So these are ways, tools that he proposes for us to train the mind in turning away from clinging, holding onto samsara so firmly.
제가 드레지 다 코아스니 상당한 드레지 당고를 코아스니 다 녀가 대탐질을 저와 대 탈바로
네.
나 강에 제가 먼저 강에 그 리유자라 탈와들라 탈바슬라미야래 제가 먼저 디초라 수 탈바도 된다니야 상로 그 코아스니지 된다랍지 레다스는 순구야
네. So in that's how we should think of samsara, and how we should think of liberation is the state where all our difficulties and problems, all our suffering dissipates. The state of true freedom from any kind of suffering, pain, and difficulty. So that is what liberation is, what freedom is. Yes, the time is over today. Okay, so let's conclude at this point for today.
장주 선조 rinpoche 마제 빠나 제지게 제바 냠바 메바야 고네 공도 태워 동니 다와 rinpoche 마제 빠나 제지게 제바 냠바 메바야 고네 공도 가리라와 고르의 신강데 편다대와 말린 중간에 전에서는 딘진자소의 샤베 시디바도 된죠. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Geshe Jamphel. It's been lovely to have you.
Okay.
Welcome back.
Okay.
And we will see you again next week.
Okay, next week. Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I know.